Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lee Middleton. I will be with you. John and I will be with you in about 1 minute's time to start today's In Conversation With. Please just bear with me, and we'll be with you in a second. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome along to today's session in conversation with the brilliant John Yates from the Youth Endowment Fund. We're going to hear lots from John as we talk back and forth this afternoon about the work of the fund and the work he's doing and some of his insights into the sector. So join us and be with us. We live streaming this across YouTube, so there is the chat function. So if you've got any thoughts, questions, reflections on today's session, you can type them in there. Our team are watching, and if there's any key time at the end and there's key points, then we'll ping them through to me, and I'll put them to John, and we'll see where we go. A few things to start before we get going. Just wanted to give colleagues give you a few updates on who we are at the National Youth Agency. Many people are aware of the NYA due to our COVID-19 role at the moment, but the NYA is the national body for youth work across England. We're the professional regulatory body, and we usually work on standards and supporting the sector to function safely and securely. We do a lot of work around policy, data, governance, and we support a lot of funders in accessing all that information and professional practice going forward. So it's an absolute pleasure to be with you today. There's a few initiatives I just wanted to sort of talk about at the top of the show, and then we'll go over to bring John in. So in the last couple of weeks, last week we launched a brand new tool for the youth sector, our new Safeguarding and Risk Management Hub. This is a tool where you will find 40 or so dedicated resources that are committed for youth work and youth work support. We can be very geeky at the NYA, and we looked at safeguarding the tools and resources that are out there in the general ether. We mapped over 1,000 safeguarding courses, but discovered that less than 3% of them had content relevant to youth work or community-based settings. So we've worked with huge range of partners and experts to create dedicated tools and resources that are youth work specific to support your practice. So if it's useful to you, go to the NYA's website and you can access that, the new Safeguarding Hub. One of the other thing I wanted to touch on was the new National Census. This is a huge project that we are kicking off in the next couple of weeks. We've been talking about this for a little while. Not for the last 10 years do we actually know who is operating in the youth sector, where they are, what they're doing, who they're working with, what are the needs of those young people. And that information is absolutely essential in terms of making business case for further funding and support, help work with funders, maybe a bit like Youth Endowment Fund here, to focus and target resources to communities where there's needed. We just don't have that information. So this is the first time in 10 years we're undertaking a mass census of the youth sector to draw all that intelligence together, and we'll make all that information, as much of it as possible, publicly available so everybody can benefit from it, everybody can use it. So keep an eye out for the National Census. It's absolutely critical that every organisation, every partner, every voluntary group, every local authority, youth centre completes the National Census, give us all that intelligence and data so we can draw up the best picture of the youth sector possible. So it's coming in about 2 weeks' time, so keep an eye out, and when it comes through, please make sure you fill it in. And then my final point is, this is not a guidance webinar. That is on Thursday. So we are, as the guidance authority for the youth sector, we are working with government to understand what we're going to be able to allow from step 3 next Monday. It's proving quite tricky. So please join us on Thursday for a different webinar where we will update you on guidance. But today is not about guidance, and we will not be focusing on that. So thank you. That's it from me. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to bring in John. Hi, John. Oh.
There we go. That's the hardest bit done. Come off mute. Lee, lovely to see you. Thanks very much for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. And how's your day been so far?
Do you know, it's been good. We've been interviewing this morning, and then spending a bit of time thinking about a few future plans. So and the sun is shining. So
and the sun is definitely shining.
I'm from Plymouth in Devon, where it was my hometown, home city, I should say, and I'm used to rain. So now I'm still perplexed when the sun shines every day, but hopefully it will rain again soon. But no, life is good today.
Fantastic, thank you. So you're our second guest on our In Conversation series. The first one was Diana Barron, the Minister for Civil Society and Young People. So, thank you so much for your time. And I know you've got a few introductory things. We want to ask you just to introduce yourself, introduce the fact that the fund, give us a bit of a flavour about what you do, what your focus are, and then we'll get into some of the detail of that later on, if that makes sense.
Leah, it's very kind. And firstly, to say thank you so much for inviting me on. I mean, I've spent most of my life working with young people or working with people who work with young people, and the chance to just try and start talking and wrestling through things with people who care so much about young people it's just such a privilege. I mean, so just to introduce myself, I'm the executive director of an organisation called the Youth Endowment Fund. Speaking of myself, I'm a person who has a career that makes absolutely no sense at all. I spent most of my adolescence getting involved in youth work, mostly because my dad was a vicar and I could either go to the church service or I could help out with the youth club, and went for the former, and got involved very heavily in residential youth work off the back of that. I then found myself working as a community worker in the East End of London, accidentally applied to be a management consultant, clicked on the wrong thing on a website. For those who aren't too close to management consultancy, think of that friend of yours who gives you advice that you didn't ask for, and imagine that they charged you for it. That's broadly what I was doing, but it was fascinating work. And then I spent a little bit of time in international development, long enough to realise the world wasn't looking for a white gingerhead saviour to solve their problem. Came back to the UK and set up a small charity that grew relatively fast, but was focused on how do you give young people the networks and the connections that they need to succeed. And now I find myself running this, leading the fund. I mean, the fund is an unusual beast. It's a charity, but born to steward this amount of money, this pot of money. 20 million pounds a year, effectively 200 million pounds. For what purpose? Well, the purpose is to try and do something to make children's life safer. I mean, many of our children grow up and they have difficulties and they have challenges, but those challenges don't seriously involve violence. But that's not true for so many of our children. And we, many of us know that all too well. Just under 1 million children live in households with sort of domestic violence. A much smaller group of young people experience serious violence in their lives, and roughly probably 10,000 young people are experiencing some sort of act of serious violence from another young person every year. And obviously 10,000 tragedies, but it's many more tragedies than it was 10 years ago. And so we know this is not inevitable. And I'm not here to sort of point the finger at the causes of that, but I am, my job is to try and find out what can we do about it? How can we change things for these young people? And at the heart of that is the charity's mission. So the mission, which hopefully is, like all missions, should be quite straightforward, is to build a consensus about what works and build a movement to put it into practice. So I think most youth workers I talk to will sort of scream at the screen, we know what works. We know what works. I think my view is, do we think the people in power know what work? And I think we have struggled to build a consensus about what's the role of mentoring, and how long should mentoring last, and should it be professional, or actually can it be informal? What's the role of therapy? When do you actually need a therapist rather than a mentor? What do we do about stop and search? What is its role? Does it have any role? These are questions. How do we resolve issues around exclusion? Is absence more important? These are questions that actually we do need to build a stronger consensus with those in power on. But my organisation completely fails if all it does is annoy people that we're interested in evidence. What it ultimately has to do is not just build a consensus about what needs to be done, it needs to deliver change. and we need to build a movement of people who want to see violence seriously reduced.
And John, we've spoken many times, and you know, I know you're doing that kind of learning what works phase first, and then there'll be other phases to come, and you'll talk through today, talk a bit more through your sort of longer term view and planning of things. You're right, youth workers would sit there and go, we've worked in communities for 20 years, we know what young people need, we need resources, we need to support them, we need to invest in this stuff. I'm interested in your comment around, you know, those in power may not understand that. Could you expand on that a bit for everybody?
Yeah, I mean, so if we take something like detached youth work, I think many of us know the value of detached youth work. We know it can be done badly. I'm sure we've, you know, grown up enough to know that, you know, it's not always done perfectly, and sometimes, you know, people are funded to do work maybe in the wrong places, with the wrong constraints, with the wrong training. It's not always done perfectly, but I think many of us would say we know the value of detached youth work. That actually there are young people out there who people are not reaching. That actually trained relationship builders, trained youth workers, building relationships without a program, without a prescriptive way of operating, can do something remarkable. I spent 2 years in government as an advisor to the Education Secretary. Let's say I was absolutely compelled by the power of detached youth work, and let's say the Secretary of State was equally compelled. It doesn't make any difference. I've got to get the money out of the Treasury, and a Treasury official is accountable ultimately to the public whose money this is. And whether you think this is good or ill, they see their fundamental duty to sort of hold back the tide of people asking for money, for whether it's on railways, whether it's on education, and they do it predominantly by saying, what's the evidence? Where's the evidence? It's lovely that people who will be employed to do this think this works. Of course yes. They do. They're going to be employed to do it. It's great. I can also show you the railway workers over here who think we should have more trains, and the doctors over here who think we should have more money for doctors. I assume that's the case. Where's the evidence? And unless you can provide that evidence, you're not going to be able to unlock some of that funding. It's by itself that it doesn't magic up the funding. You can have the evidence and still not get the money. So that's why I talk about we need to build a movement as well. You know, you actually need to build a groundswell of demand for detached youth work, for example, so that politicians are getting badgered. I think this is what we saw happening with school funding a few years ago. The government got caught in a real pincer movement of pretty clear evidence saying that actually you know, schools and education does seem to be helpful, and a groundswell of the public complaining about school cuts. You've got to have both. And our role isn't, we're not a campaign organisation, but we are serious about saying, let's work out, let's build that consensus. And sometimes that will say something doesn't work that we all care about a lot, but let's build that consensus and let's mobilise where people want to mobilise people behind what the evidence says.
That's really, really useful. And I guess the census I talked about at the beginning of this is about trying to create the evidence, the data that we can help make those business cases, and obviously work with the likes of yourselves and others. I know you, although you're doing the kind of what works feature at the moment to sort of gather the intelligence to be able to present that back, I know you're also, there is some funding you are distributing and making available to the sector. Do you want to give us a bit of a flavour about what's coming in the near future, and what, you know, our audience should be keeping an eye out for to make sure that, you know, they're engaged with it?
Absolutely. So we've already committed roughly £30 million. And so I think, you know, a good test of whether we're spending our money probably is whether people feel they've got the money. The reason I say that is even £20 million is a drop in the ocean. You know, there's so much need out there. There's so many people who are passionate and can make a huge difference. So even if we spent all of our money in 1 year, there will be organisations who don't have enough money. So, you know, I just want to be honest, you know, that actually the best judge of whether we're spending our cash probably isn't whether people feel flush. There's just not enough money to achieve anything like that. We've committed about £33 million. We're going to put out this year up to about £40 million more, or commit another £40 million. And we're going to do it mostly through two quite big rounds of focused funding. And this is the point, actually, that the point I made about that our money, even if we spent it, wouldn't make a massive felt difference. What's the conclusion of that? apart from that we're never going to be massively popular because there's never going to be enough money to pay for everything. The conclusion is us just spending our money isn't going to be enough for the young people who need help. We've got to actually use the money, as I say, to build consensus and to push the change. So the way we want to do that is to focus. And so we're going to, the round that is open at the moment is around focus on diversion from the criminal justice system. So we know that there are young people who are arrested in this country. They don't get taken to court. They are not charged. What sort of provision do they receive? Many of them, we think, receive nothing. There are other young people who receive youth cautions or receive cautions who do receive diversionary programs. Which of those do we know work? And can we build the consensus and the evidence to get more proof behind them? We're also looking in that diversionary space at hospital navigator programs. So there's been a big growth in hospital navigator programs. The people who deliver it, I think, are passionate about the difference they can make. But again, we don't really have the evidence. And it's quite a good example where I think it's fair to say that people will say to me, but John, I know what works. And the first person will say, I know what works, hospital navigators work. And the next person will say, I know what works, hospital navigators does not work. Well, we can't know if people are saying the different things. So let's build the consensus. The second round of funding that we're going to open around September time is around how do we help to give young people a supportive home. So we're focused particularly on support to parents and carers of children aged between 6 and 14 who lack basic needs that they should have in their life. And how do we provide support? It could be because a parent is addicted to or has a substance misuse or an alcohol misuse challenge. It could be related to parental conflict. It could be related to poverty. But we're focusing particularly on that parental relationship, that carer relationship. And the advantage of these focuses is that we can build a consensus and we can push for change. And so that's what we're always going to try and come back to.
And so that'll be available September-ish.
That's exactly right. And we'll be opening up though space for people to lobby us, to talk to us, to tell us what not to focus on, to tell us what to focus on in advance of that. And we'll take those points now. If people want to get in, drop me an email or whatever they want to do. We're keen to be challenged and pushed and poked.
And the sort of the diversionary funding from the criminal justice system, is that available at the moment? Is that sort of active at the moment? People can apply today. Go to your website. How can people find more information and get?
That's access? Right. So if you Google search Youth Endowment Fund and you go to our website, you'll find it. You should find it very easily there. But we called that round Another Chance. All our rounds are based on 8 fundamental needs that we believe that every young person in this country should have met. So one of them is for children to have another chance. Another one is for children to have a supportive home. And you'll find that all our rounds fit into, we tried to really listen to young people. What are the needs you feel childhood should have met? And that's what we focus around.
If you're interested in Youth Endowment Fund's plans and strategies, all on their website, you can go and have a look at the various things. There's some slide decks on there. I know that she'll share these information. Brilliant, John, that's really helpful. I'm really interested in your thoughts around the pandemic and how the pandemic has changed things. So, young people have been hit hard. Our own research, working with the Children's Commissioner Office, showed, normal life, there's about 1 million young people engaged in youth services. That number is now 3 million young people needed access. So, the impact of lockdown, the impact of the pandemic, the way gangs have changed their behaviour and the way they're operating. Obviously, this stuff is interesting to you. How do you think the pandemic has had an impact in terms of the youth sector and on young people particularly?
I think the first thing I'd say is we know very little. I think there is a real tendency to take the pieces of information that we have, whether it's pieces of data or whether it's anecdotal, and say, this is what's happening right now with young people's lives. We're talking about millions who are in incredibly different contexts, in a once in a generation, hopefully few generations experience. I think it's the first thing I'd say is I don't think we really as a country have a clear sense of what's gone on in children's lives over the last year, and I think that is sort of quite troubling. And maybe it comes back to the importance of the census that you're doing, but maybe I'll sort of come back to this point. I think in this absence of knowing what's happening, I think sometimes we've sort of jumped to conclusions that actually probably weren't quite right. So, I was told quite early on by people I respect hugely, this is going to lead to a huge uptick in interpersonal violence between young people. That didn't happen during the first lockdown, and people said, well, that's because of the lockdown. The same people who had said during the lockdown violence is going to rise then told me it's obvious because of the lockdown, but wait till the lockdown ends and it's going to be a huge spike. The violence rose when the lockdown ended, which makes sense. Obviously interpersonal violence outside of a home is likely to rise when people are out of their homes, but it actually was lower than it was the year before by about 10%. And yet I had a number of people saying to me, look, violence is higher than it was last year. When the data came through, it actually wasn't, it was lower. Whereas domestic abuse and domestic violence definitely rose during the period. And so I think that the first thing I'd say is it's really easy to sort of, I think, want to answer that question with a clear narrative. Lee, it's got so much worse, everything's terrible. I think that the reality is we don't really know that much. We do know, what do we know? We know that domestic abuse and domestic violence became a bigger problem in young people's lives. Yeah. We know that a number of young people became invisible, which I think is the thing I wanted to come back to. I think that's the biggest worry we've got, that these young people who rely on adults, including many of those of us who are in this conversation, lost that contact. That contact is really valuable. And therefore they became much less visible. Those young people were not in school, the ones who were, and therefore they became invisible. I think that is the sort of biggest worry. We've definitely seen from the data that's been released issues with young people with learning. But I think the loss is not necessarily as large in all cases as is sometimes perceived. I think from the data I've seen, it varies hugely depending on the context that the child is in. I've had relatively convincing accounts of children in care who have actually found the period of lockdown to be a more positive experience, and that away from some of the stresses and challenges that school can bring. So I do think the picture is quite complicated. I think that what is sort of unavoidably quite undebatable is the impact on the labour market. And who is losing these jobs? It is young people more than anyone else. Who is entering into a labour market that is not very well set up or very ready? It's young people. And so I think we've got a lot of uncertainty, a lot of risk for young people, and a very unwelcome labour market. So I think we really need the government, and I think there are signs of this with the education recovery work, but we really need the government to focus on young people as they re-enter.
Yeah, I think a lot of the stuff that research that we've done, some young people have really thrived throughout lockdown, which is really interesting. We have an education system that doesn't work for a lot of young people. And the last Children's Commissioner left saying, was it a fifth of young people leave secondary school without meaningful qualifications? I'm really interested to see how as a nation we might wake up to that and adapt how we adjust things. Today the Prime Minister will talk about more skills. I know that's for adults, but we'll learn more in the future weeks about catch up and the process over the summer, which we're all very enthusiastic about, I guess, to see what's going to come, see how youth workers can play a role in that. I'm interested in your thoughts around the role of youth work in this space and how we help young people recover, and the hidden, oft I've run a big national county youth service, and my teams used to talk to us all the time around young people who weren't going to school, who weren't engaged with services, but they would engage with their local youth worker. We've heard lots of things in our webinars about the pandemic around, can I go and do a home visit? Because I've not heard from this young person for so long and I'm really worried about them. Only recently we allowed that to sort of take place. I'm interested in your thoughts around the role of youth work in the pandemic and how the youth workers have adapted, and what you're learning about the kind of best practice of that and how we might take that, keep the good bits and drop some of the bits that haven't worked.
Yes, one of the things we did during the pandemic was put out about £6 million of funding to fund about 130 organisations to try and sustain and possibly expand and adapt the work that they were doing. It's quite a good example again of what we do can help, but it actually still is a drop in the ocean. But what we found in that work was quite a lot of detached youth work being proposed. There's also quite a lot of online work. I think we do need more research on online. and what works and what doesn't work. There's a report that the fund put out, which you can find online, about what we found, that certain types of work, particular, and some of it's common sense. So one-on-one work can be effective online if the child has the facilities and the equipment and the privacy, which a lot of children don't. But it can be effective. But unsurprisingly, more group-based activities will struggle to adapt. I mean, these are sort of rather obvious points, but important that I think people sort of grapple with them and don't think online is a panacea. We were very keen to get more detached youth work going on because the rules allowed the space for it. And it seemed like the right thing to be supporting. I mean, as in the question of the role of youth work, I mean, I want to defer to you almost, Lee, on such a sort of, and to other people in the conversation on such a sort of fundamental question. I think, I've spent 15, 20 years doing different bits with young people, and now I run an organisation obviously focused on particular part of young people's lives around violence. I sometimes think that it's an almost unanswerable question. What is the role of adult work?
Yeah.
No one would try to answer that question. Young people are human beings aged between, where do you want to draw the line, 11 and 25?
25, we draw the line, yeah.
I mean, that is that they are hugely diverse, having hugely different needs. And so I sort of always sort of struggle a bit with the question when I was in, what's the joined up strategy for youth? I found it almost a little patronizing, like, young people, should we think of, you wouldn't have a joined up strategy to 40-year-olds. You think it was sort of a bit odd. I think we've got to recognize just the sort of complexity of young people's lives and say, actually, what's the strategy to give them an adult that they trust? What's the strategy to give them a supportive home? I come back to these needs that I'm a bit obsessed with. What's the strategy to give them another chance? What's the strategy to give them a safe neighborhood? And those in themselves need separate answers. And the thing I would just rather sort of simply come back to is children need an adult they can trust. If you're going to start with one thing, I think, we're going to publish in a few weeks' time, later in June, something called the YEF Toolkit, which is like which magazine or Rotten Tomatoes, if you prefer, for youth violence. It's a simple, single website you can go to. Which magazine is a better analogy because it's based on 2,000 research projects. This is a really authoritative piece of work, but it's really hugely accessible. And one of the things that will come through it is the value of mentoring. What my experience being mentors and mentoring young people, it comes down to, as so much of what we care about, it comes down to relationships.
I think that's the point from youth work is all about relationships, and I guess reflecting on your question around the pandemic, digital work really well for some young people. You can have a certain degree of rapport, but it's very different to being face to face or in a group. And I've had lots of conversations with local authorities and funders who are like, well, we'll just fund more digital stuff. It's worked really well. But actually, young people they're social animals. They want to build rapport and relationships with their friends, their peers, or a youth worker, and they want to do that in the real world. They want to get out there and reconnect, and actually just saying we'll provide all services digitally will fail. It will miss the point around, we are human beings. We are built and geared and designed and brain wired to go and connect with other people, and we need to make sure that. I guess what we've learned through the pandemic is that the damage to those relationships, or the strain some of those relationships have been under due to distance, due to technology, due to time, and lives of young people becoming more complex because you're locked up at home with your family and you can't go out. And hey, I can't spend more than a weekend with my parents, and I'm desperate to go back home. So it's it's so difficult for so many young people, and being able to access and engage with as a relationship with a trusted adult or youth worker. I want to come back to your talk in a minute, but you talked about the sort of I talked about the head at the top of this, our census, the data, the intelligence that's needed to make the case, the information of knowing what's out there and how that can help. I mean, what's your thoughts on, I know you've been sort of supporting us with the census behind the scenes. I mean, what's your sort of thoughts around the value of that kind of work and how that can add to what you're doing in terms of what works to sort of back up the business case? Because as an organisation, the NYA is absolutely determined to work with a myriad of other sector organisations in the spending review this autumn to say, here's an awful lot of data, intelligence, and information. Where's the investment in young people? Because you're right, your 200 million is a scratch. 20 million a year is a scratch compared to the billion that we've lost out of frontline services. How do we make the case to put that back in, and is the census useful to you? I'm interested in your thoughts around the census.
Yeah, I think the census is. I think the census is really important. I mean, I think what I think that there isn't. I talked earlier about children becoming invisible during the pandemic. I think for at least a decade, clarity about what's being delivered has been relatively invisible, and that's obviously why this is so important. I mean, there have been attempts in that period to try and do some things like this, but I think what they've struggled with is getting enough take up, and so you end up with a picture that doesn't tell you very much because it's so partial. And so anything we can do to amplify the value of everyone filling this in, I think is critical, because most of the youth work that I experienced as a young person wasn't government funded. It came through either a foundation funding it or linked to the church I was involved in. And so there's quite a long tail, as you'll know, of stuff that goes on. And so the more clarity we can bring to what's going on in the local authority context, in the foundation context, in the voluntary context, I think is really valuable, especially if we're able to work together. Or one of the rounds we would like to do in the future is around adult you can trust. Is around looking at what do we know about the best ways of providing that relationship to a child, and funding and testing work in that space. Now, if we can show the value of that work, and we can show where there's not very much of that work, I mean, that's a very powerful combination.
It is. I mean, it's interesting. I talk to officials quite a lot in government, and we always used to talk about that. We thought there's around 10,000 organisations in the youth sector doing stuff, but nobody was really true. And they always thought that was way too high. Actually, the first version of the census work we've done, 16,000. So there's an awful lot of stuff going on out there. But what is the quality of it? What is the support for those brilliant people doing it? How much of it's very voluntary? How much of it's professional? In one way, it doesn't matter. But once you know what you've got, then you can invest in it. You can support it. And the gaps of that data have been so challenging for us all. John, you mentioned your toolkit, and I'm not Rotten Tomatoes, was it Which magazine? So do you want to sort of expand a little bit more about where's that come from, and what's your hope for that moving forward, and how can people watching in real time or catch up kind of go and use that, and what's the purpose of that for you, and how can people here help you build that in the future? Because I know it's an ongoing thing. It's not a one-off, I don't believe.
That's right. So one of the things that sort of troubled me when I took on this job is where do I go, Lee, to see the existing evidence? We know there is evidence. Great. John and his team have turned up and they're going to produce more evidence. There's already loads of evidence. Where is that evidence? Where do I go to find it? And of course, there'll be some of it on your website. There'll be some of it on UK Youth's website. There'll be some of it, but when is it in one place? And what if one bit says X and one bit says Y? What does it say on average? Where can I go to find that? I'm pretty certain mentoring is effective. Where do I go to, where do I take the Treasury official or the local authority commissioner and go, look, there's been 30 really powerful pieces of research and they've concluded this. Where do I go to do that? Do I have to pull that together? I've got a youth group to run. There isn't somewhere like that. There isn't a single source that you can go to which is trusted. I mean, there isn't one that's untrusted, I don't think, but there isn't a single source that pulls together all the research. So that's the gap we wanted to fill. Now that can sound really dry. This is not something that's dry. This is pretty. If we can do this right, this is pretty shaking. So let me just explain what we did. There's about 2,000 pieces of good quality research that people have conducted on what can be done, and I should underline, to reduce violence. And people will say to me, "Why reducing violence? It's so negative. Young people are assets. Why are you focusing on?" The truth is, this is what we were set up to do. It's put into my sort of founding document, so I have to sort of honour that promise. So that's the focus.
It's your job.
That is my job. And so, okay, we pulled together these 2,000 pieces of research, and we've mapped it. We built the biggest repository of research on reducing violence in the world. And you can go online and you can find a map with all of those 2,000 pieces. Don't do that. It's very difficult to follow and it's incredibly complicated. I mean, I'm sure everyone could do it, but it would take a lot of time. It makes much more sense to wait till around the 20th of June, when we will have synthesized all of that research together into a summary of what it says. And we're producing, effectively, if you want to lead, that says, okay, let's take anti-bullying programs. Schools run anti-bullying programs. Research has been done on the impact on them. First of all, do they help to reduce violence? Yes or no? Okay, they do a bit. How much? Some. Okay, a little bit. Okay, what other impacts do they have? Actually, they have loads of other good impacts. So you might want to fund them. They're not maybe the best way to reduce violence, but they have lots of other nice benefits. Okay, what about parental support? What if we get support to parents? That would appear to have more impact, pound for pound. That would appear to be quite significantly likely to be a better bet. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do the anti-bullying programs, but does mean that if someone's telling you that parental support is a waste of time, you've got a pretty clear sight that it's not. But there's some, the research tells us that some of that works better than others. So it's, if you're planning to, if the local authority is planning to run a series of one-off online webinars on how to have a better relationship with your child, that's probably not a very good use of money. But if someone's actually going to work consistently with a parent who's got an alcohol misuse issue and actually provide therapeutic support for them, that could be very effective to help the child. So it's providing that in one very simple place that you can go. And I think it's worth underlining it. Maybe it comes across. The Youth Endowment Fund is focused on young people. And it sounds obvious, but we're focused on how do we reduce violence for young people. That includes the youth sector, but it's not exclusive to the youth sector. So, what needs to happen in schools? What do the police need to do differently? What needs to happen at GPs? What needs to happen with regard to the way that social work works? We're very clear that our client is the youth, is the young person, is the child, and it's everything that impacts on that child that we need to focus on.
Super. So 20th of June, what an incredible new resource will be released. Is there like a monthly version of it, or there key themes or their key papers that you're looking at? If I wanted to understand, I know the Partnership for Young London has worked with King's College University they looked at like 130 reports into open access youth work, which overwhelmingly said it really works. This is good stuff. Is that kind of content going to be available through what you're achieving, and have we been writing what's coming?
Great question. So we're going to launch it with 12 entries to the league table. League table is the wrong phrase. It's just something we're trying to compete things. We're trying to say that what is really well proven and likely to highly work, and what sort of looks good but maybe not quite so good, and what in some cases doesn't work. We're going to launch it with 12 areas, and then we'll update it every 6 months, adding new areas. It's worth just briefly saying there is a slight difference in the way we work from how other people might pull together evidence. So in previous jobs I've done, I spent a lot of time working on the importance of networks for young people. I would pull together all the research I could find through sort of a bit of Googling, a bit of talking to academics, and I'll pull it all together, and I would write my own sort of summary of what it says. And I'll try to do that as honourably as I could, but I do have a slight bias towards what I'm doing, obviously, but I tried to do it as honourably as I could. The slight difference we've taken here is just to be slightly more prescriptive to the way we did it. So we've said, okay, we're only going to look for things that are focused in these countries. So if we find something amazing that's in a country that really this context is very different, we're not going to cheat and let it in just to make it look better. And we're only going to look for things that actually have been relatively robustly done. And so we set some rules out first. The advantage of my personal view is it makes the advice we're giving better. The more probably pertinent thing is it makes it more trusted by those who have influence and power. So it just gives us a bit more oomph when we say that this really is sound stuff and more money needs to go into it.
That's really good, really good. And any youth work students on the call, doing their degree, masters, might be a really good resource of information referenced up to go and have a look at, tap into for your whatever essays or projects you're developing. John, I'm interested. So I'm interested in, obviously, youth work. That's the NYA's kind of bag. That's what we do. So in terms of sort of the knowledge and the information that you've been gathering from the varying reports and what have you, I'm just really interested in what is your vision for youth work going forward, and the kind of, how do you see youth work changing, and how do you see that happening in the future?
Yeah, so again, so underlining my point that I do want to focus as much as I can on young people and what do they need, which is obviously hugely multifaceted, rather than just the youth sector or a particular part of the youth sector. It's such a diverse sector. You don't need me to remind you of that. Look, I think the way I see the future from the Youth Endowment Fund's point of view is, if I take this issue of reducing violence, as I say, we have many thousands of young people, and I spend time as much as I can listening to them, feeling frequently unsafe, very anxious, hypervigilant. I mean, this is not true of lots of our young people, which is marvelous, but for many young people, hypervigilant about threats. What do we need to see? We need to see this being continually taken seriously, at a political level as well as locally. And at the moment, I'd say that's probably not the case. At the moment, I think what we have is a sense that something should be done about serious violence, but not a sense that we are looking to try and transform children's lives. And I think there's a slight sense, unless we're careful, that violence for some of these young people is just seen as inevitable. And what we need to do over the next decade is change the narrative. The violence is not inevitable. Our societies used to be much more violent than they are now. This is good news. The research has shown that actually, remarkably, the modern is generally, on average, better than the past when it comes to violence. But in the last 10 years, it's gone into reverse. It doesn't have to be that way. We do not have to have violence as a real threat for young people, but that requires, and this would be my sort of fundamental vision, that requires us to think about young people primarily and about our sector boundaries secondarily. What is it that, and so this comes totally naturally to so many youth workers, what actually needs to change for this young person, and how do we give it to them? And therefore, again, how do we come back in our conversations to what are the fundamental needs of young people? What is the evidence? And I do think the evidence is important, even if we think we know it already. What does the evidence tell us works best to meet those needs? So let me give you one specific example. I think one of the needs of young people that we need to address over the next decade is having a safe, positive place to learn. Now, there's been a lot of debate of late about exclusions and the role that exclusions play in robbing children of a safe place to learn. There's not been nearly as much focus on absence.
Yeah.
But more children miss having a safe, positive place to learn because of absence than because of exclusions. There's actually quite a lot of space for consensus on what we need to do about absence. It's not a political hot potato in the same way exclusions has been, but we're not even really talking about it. Why are these children not in school? Actually, it leads you into issues of mental health, which brings you back to CAMS. Well, actually, if we want to, the government says it wants to close the learning gap. Well, a lot of the children are not learning because they're not in school. Well, we need to get them into school. Well, what works to get them into school? Yes, the school has a role, but so also can great youth workers. So we need youth workers to work with schools to make that happen. But this comes back to, what is the vision, which has to be around the need, young people having a positive, safe place to learn. What's stopping them? Actually, absence is a huge part of it. So we don't need a political fight over that. There's an issue. What do we need to do about it? Well, let's get the evidence to prove what works around anxiety, around getting extra support where people don't have it, and around anti-bullying. And let's then try and prove it, and then let's push for it. And some of that won't even require more money. It will require schools to work differently with other organisations. And so that will be an example. Put the need of the child first and then push with the evidence to make the change happen.
Yeah, I'm really interested in the absent individual, may not be attending school, not attending services, and they're the ones that often youth workers do engage with better than other professions. And I guess that's why I got into youth work, was to support those people. I think we can't really talk about serious youth violence without the kind of the reflection around racial justice and some of the challenges that some of that has sort of typically in the local news and in the London area in particular, where I've sort of pick up stabbings, etc., are young black males that are involved. And NYA is doing some work around racial justice, around supporting practitioners, etc. But I'm interested in the sort of development of your thinking and the learning that you've got from the research stuff. What is that telling you about racial justice and, you know, the indifference or the imbalance of the impact on young people, certain groups of young people in society, and how youth workers might be, you know, well placed to try and tackle and address that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in justice is an overused word, but it's the right word for what's going on. And I don't need to sort of tell people things they already know, but we just need to look at the statistics around. Let's talk about children in this country, black children in this country, who are much more likely to end up, a very small number of children end up in secure accommodation, in the secure state, sorry, but they are disproportionately, it's disproportionately likely if you're a black child. It's disproportionately likely if you're from if you're from the global majority, if you're an ethnic minority child. It's clear, and I think, you know, a dialogue on race over the last year, for very unfortunate reasons, but has got much sharper. You know, it's much clearer that we need to talk not just about individual prejudice, which I think is real and alive, but also you know, what's actually true of the country systems as a whole, even if we can't always diagnose why. You know, you can see it. You know, poverty obviously is disproportionately affecting children from ethnic minority backgrounds. So, you know, there is injustice in this country. When we talk about our 8 needs, one of them is to live in a just society. And racial injustice is absolutely pivotal to that. So those are some words. What does that mean in practice for us? So it means a couple of things. Firstly, I want to make sure that the team that I work with represents modern Britain. And so last time I got the data, 25% of our staff are black, around 35% of our staff are global majority ethnic background. You know, that's really necessary, because otherwise we don't have proper conversations and we don't spot things, and we have blind spots about what's going on in this country. The second thing is making sure that our funding reaches organisations that might not normally access funds. You know, I need to be sort of remind us, you know, be clear. Ultimately, what the fund needs to do is build this consensus and push for change. The money is not going to do that by itself, but how we allocate the money, it's got to be just. And so we've committed £10 million over the next just the next 3 years that will be allocated just to global majority led ethnically global majority led organisations, and that's to backstop to say, even if all our other allocation was done disproportionately, we will make sure that there is proportionate money going to organisations led by global majority Brits. So the provision of money is the second thing. The final thing here that we've got to get right is, in all the rounds we do, we will have a report as part of informing our decision making about disproportionality. You know, actually, what do we know is disproportionality about the criminal justice system in the first round? What do we know is disproportionality about having a supportive home? So we have that front and centre. And obviously having a diverse team makes that much easier to be front and centre. But the final thing is, and this is a sort of tricky point, we've also got to make sure that the evaluation we do is big sample sizes, because otherwise you can't break it down to understand the impact on smaller groups in society. So you could find that something works for the average child, but doesn't work for a particular group. And that actually is, that's another sort of injustice you can miss. The only final thought I'd just make on this, Lee, is you know, this organisation is determined, and we won't always get it right, but it's determined to be thoughtful and challenged around racial justice. But we must also sort of just keep reminding ourselves that the majority of children who commit violent crime or are victims of violent crime in this country are white. And there is a danger that we sort of lose track of that really important point. For all the right intentions, we accidentally sort of elude violence with a particular group of our population, which I think would be a mistake. And so I do constantly try and remind the team and others of this fact. Violence is indiscriminate. It haunts so many of us, and we must do something about it.
Yeah, and exploitation of young people is happening everywhere. Nice little villages right the way through to big cities. You mentioned about the violence was going down, but in the last 10 years it's been going up, and it's in the last 10 years we've seen cuts to youth services on such huge scale. And for us, going back to the relationship piece, your youth worker in the community doing detached work, engaging young people, prevented them from entering, going down negative pathways, and so there's some interesting things that I think we can all reflect upon about that. I'm really interested in how the voice of young people are playing into your work and how you're supporting that, because I know young people are experts in their own reality. They're experts in their own lived experience. And I know Ray Douglas, who's running our Equal Equity program, our program around racial justice, would say, PhD of the streets. Some young people have an absolute PhD of living on the streets. So I'm really interested in the work you're doing around involving young people in the foundation and what you're trying to achieve with that, and talk us through some of the peer research I think you've been developing as well.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. Ray is someone I found a phenomenal aid. I must say.
He's an amazing chap.
Just such huge. I mean, sparing his blushes, but just some people benefit hugely from just hearing the amounts of wisdom that they have, and Ray is one of them. So I was appointed effectively by young people. I had two interview panels. One was with trustees of the organisation, and the other was with young people, organised by Leap Confronting Conflict. I think they probably got me the job. I think I did better with them than I did with the other group. I think it's pivot. This is really important because I talked about I want the team to represent modern Britain. We don't when it comes to age. The majority, our staff are all over 18, and I think that's right. But it's a weakness, and so the way that we're addressing it is two things. One is the establishment of a youth advisory board, who all decisions that are going through they will comment on. And we're looking at exactly how they might flow into the decision-making boards as well, which is a matter for my chair to sort of work through, but I think is a sort of sensible way to think about these things. The second is actually three things here. The second is we're funding with help from the co-op and from the I Will Fund, the largest youth-led research project on reducing violence ever in the UK, potentially ever in the world. So we're spending £5 million on in every single area of England and Wales. We don't operate in Scotland. Everything area or Northern Ireland, everything area of England and Wales, getting young people leading. What do we know about what reduces violence in my local area? What do we know causes violence in my local area? And going out and being supported and trained, professionally trained, so that then they can go and talk to their friends and others to bring together what they want to say about what needs to be done. And I think somebody might say, well, that's a lot of money to spend on giving young people a voice. I just think it's absolutely critical. It's what is it? It's 2% of our money. It seems to be absolutely critical that we do that. The final thing is, I want to try and find a way for every person who works in the organisation to spend time with young people. And I've sort of wrestled a bit with, do I mandate volunteering? And I decided not to do that. But that gives you a sense of what's on my mind. Actually, it's great that you're the expert on running a randomized control trial. That's great that you're absolutely brilliant about public affairs. That's amazing that you're great at graphic design. I'd actually like you to really understand young people's lives. You wouldn't trust an organisation that makes ice cream if no one there ever ate ice cream. How do we make sure we're actually understanding what we're talking about? And I don't. I spent most of my life not being a funder. I spent most of my life delivering, and this was my constant sort of plea to funders, and so I need to live up to it.
That's amazing. So young people, right at the heart of what you're trying to achieve, feeding in that and using the across the country researchers. I mean, £5 million. It's a small amount of money, actually. I mean, to do it really well. I mean, I've always said Youth Voice is expensive stuff. To do it properly, to really engage the right young people in the right way and give them the support and the encouragement to amplify their voice. So That's really, really, really encouraging. We're into our last few minutes, John. I can't believe how time has flown by. But the one thing I just want to touch on, you're an author, I understand. I saw you very proudly on social media the other week unboxing your new book. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about that book and where that's come from and how you've got away?
That's very kindly. So the book is called Fractured, Why Our Societies Are Coming Apart and How We Put Them Back Together Again. And it's born of it's a mystery book with 3 mysteries. Why are we so divided? Why does it matter? What do we do to fix it? And we live in times, whether here in the UK or in the US or in France, where our societies feel particularly fractured. And I think it's time that someone tried to lay out what's causing it and what we do to fix it. And the book, I started writing the book when Brexit was a typo and Donald Trump was just a figure of fun and no more. And I finished the book on the day that the Capitol was stormed in Washington, DC. And what I'm trying to do with the book is there are a lot of great books that you read and you get a sense of, yeah, this is appalling, something must be done. And then the author sort of looks away at the moment of saying what actually needs to be done. And I was determined to avoid that. So the book is pretty clear about what could be done and what might need to be done. It's quite punchy as a result. And it's not irrelevant at all to all the stuff we've been talking about. How do we give young people the networks and the connections that they need to succeed? How do we give young people the positive peer groups from diverse backgrounds? How do we achieve racial justice? Partly about networks and connections and understanding and space for people to speak truth to power. A lot of this comes back to people, we too easily live in silos. How do we break down some of those barriers? And so the book, HarperCollins are publishing it a month today, roughly 10th of June, available from all good and probably some bad bookshops. So do feel free to pre-order yourself a copy.
I wasn't giving you a chance to sell it that way, but I look forward to NYA receiving a copy for its library. The NYA library would love that copy, put a copy in there for you. John, thank you so much. Any final reflections? We've got 1 minute left. It's been really interesting to talk to you, and obviously the diverse things. Some funding's coming in. Some's already out now. Some in June. Reports. The toolkit's on its way. Any final messages? Anything you'd like to get across that we've not covered in the last 30 seconds or so?
I think the final thing is, please don't hesitate to critique us. Send us thoughts. Tell us what we're doing wrong. I have a duty here to try and make a difference for young people's lives. I don't have a duty to be popular. I'm not going to strive to do that. I am going to strive to try and make a difference. And that is going to be made a lot easier if people who are super thoughtful and spend their time working with young people tell me what we're doing wrong. If we're doing something right, that's great to hear too, of course, but tell me what we should be doing differently. And I read every email I get. I am john.yates@youthendowmentfund.org.uk. I don't mind people emailing me directly. No H in the John. Lee, I just really appreciate the chance to chat and all that you're doing at the NYA.
No, thank you very much. And there you go, folks. Direct invite to email John directly. And trust me, when I've had conversations with John one-on-one, we've reflected some thoughts and comments back to try and help the fund improve. And certainly when there's the first round of detached youth work training, we kind of took the red pen to quite a lot of stuff to try and help the fund right at the beginning. So it's great. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the second in our series of In Conversations. There are more of these coming. This is the first one with a funder. We've had the minister, now funder, and we'll be moving on in a couple of weeks' time to the next one. So keep an eye out on our YouTube channel, keep an eye on NYA's social media. Follow John, he's on Twitter, and I know follow the foundation and the fund and keep involved. And thank you so much to everyone for joining us. It's been a really interesting afternoon. John, thank you once again for your time. I know how busy you are. And have a great day, everybody. Take care.
Thanks, Lee.
Take care.